everyone. Thanks for making time to be here this afternoon. We have before us an agenda. I'm going to put the link to the Google Doc in the chat for everyone so that you've got it handy. And before we dive in on it, I want to see if there's anything else that folks want to add to the agenda, because I think the agenda we have, we're going to be able to get through before our meeting posted end time. So we do have some space if there are other things that folks want to make sure we can discuss today. All right, I'm getting the thumbs up from Alistair that he's got what he needs on the agenda. Anything else you'd like to add, Ruth or Carlene?
Nope.
Cool. All right, then we'll spend the first part of the meeting in discussion. We'll start with talking about homeschooling because I know Carlene and Zachary had a chance to touch base on that. So we'll see what else we can get to. We'll talk about the literacy survey, and Caitlin sent us a link to the updated survey earlier. I'll put that in the chat as we get there too. And then we'll talk a little bit more about ethnic studies and how presenting to the SAC went. And then I'd love to get some insights from you all about how to spend time with the next SISAC meeting, which is in 2 weeks. And then we'll make any necessary updates to our work plan and wrap up for the day. Thank you in advance, Darren, for taking notes. I appreciate you being in charge of that. We'll jump in on the homeschooling panel. So Dr. Reed, I'm going to turn this over to you for a little while. The one thing I hope we can walk away with is what we're hoping to learn from this panel. I know you and Zachary had a chance to talk a little bit about it. And then what we can each do to help prepare for this, whether it's identifying panelists or suggesting some questions or whatever we can do to help make this happen in July.
Okay. So yeah, I think the last time we kind of boiled down to we wanted to just kind of do a temperature check on our homeschooling community, both I guess in families that have been using that option, and then families because of the pandemic have been taking that option and considering to continue it for a while or a bit, or possibly take the option permanently. So does that ring a bell in regards to, okay, because I think that's what we landed on. We got a wonderful kind of preview. Actually, Brittany Wade, Mrs. Wade, I was happy to see her because that's kind of what I envisioned. And she was was one of the stories that made me interested in the topic of parents taking the option because they weren't happy with either the way of virtual learning or the push for heavy technology in virtual learning. And again, she wasn't the only family that experienced something similar. So yeah, that was kind of like what we saw from Mrs. Wade. Like that's kind of what I would like to like have more individuals speak on, just like how things are going. So I guess in regards to help with getting more families, I mean, I would love to have Mrs. Wade to come back because I know she testified related to technology. I just happen to know that she was homeschooling. But maybe invite her back because and prepare like either some questions or have her at least knowing that she's going to testify on homeschooling, and either maybe other parents that maybe she knows, or I'm not sure if there are any. I know Representative Sutter, you mentioned like there's collaboratives, but basically just getting folks to say like or talk about like how are things going, and because homeschooling, I believe the standards are in our purview. Something around homeschooling is in our purview, according to the website. Basically seeing, if any of what they mention is in our wheelhouse. Somebody has their hand up. So I think that's pretty much the gist of it. I can't see who has their hand up.
It's
Oh,
Ruth. So whenever you're ready, we can
oh,
get
okay.
to her first.
So yeah, that's kind of background information. I can stop before we move on to like structuring, or do you want me to? Do we want to talk more about identifying panelists, or I'm having to move on to like structuring questions, or take a question at the moment?
I have one
Let's see what
question.
Ruth has to say, and then we can go from there.
So I may have already answered this in my mind. It may be a question that I hadn't and is now already answered, but let me pose it, which is when I think of homeschooling, I think of not, a fairly small group of people that pull out of the system altogether in order to have their own curriculum, their own approach, et cetera, et cetera. And it may be that that's what this is about. What I was thinking is that part of it was also about in some way, but it's not. So this is what this, I'm going to ask a question that actually my assumption was wrong. So let me just say that. So, but I wonder if we want to put into this a slightly different thing, which is I think there are a lot of families that would like a virtual option. And I was thinking, is that just sort of what, is part of what's interesting people in homeschooling is the virtual option? I guess the homeschooling people are really people who opted out of the virtual option this year. So they're really totally different things, but I wonder if they're connected in some way and or if they should be.
That's actually why I proposed like two different topics, because
I may have raised this before. Okay, all right.
No, actually, I don't think you raised it in this light. But there are two separate issues. They possibly could overlap, but for this one, true homeschooling, or maybe not true homeschooling, because I'm not really sure myself as an individual who was in-person school all my life. But in a sense of like individuals who are doing homeschooling and not necessarily the virtual, taking a virtual option. I do have an interest in looking at the virtual option because I do think virtual schooling is going to be a wave. And I think DC is going to have a possibility of more virtual schools opening. And that was something that I have a question about too, is if, what are standards possibly around virtual schools? Because I know, kind of just watching, there's been, and not trying to lump people into, but we have a great already set. We already have a virtual option. DC Public Schools is mentioned they're interested in having possibly a virtual middle school to high school pipeline. And then unfortunately, you also see some funky things nationally where there's some fraud going on with virtual schools. Not all, but I've noticed enough in just a couple of news briefs that's happened. So that's something I think DC should get ahead of a wave, but I want to possibly keep that one separate from individuals who, are either accessing a curriculum to homeschool, whether that be online, formally taking the OSCE process or considering taking the OSCE process, like those folks. Versus people who are enrolling in a virtual school to take
I'm intrigued by both of these questions as well, Dr. Reed. I think that as I understand the homeschooling community in DC, there were previously around 350 to 400 families who had chosen the option, and in the year of the pandemic, we saw that number roughly double. And those are families who registered with OSCE as homeschoolers, meaning that they would identify their own curriculum, run their own curriculum and instruction, and that they would deliver that instruction to their students on their own with oversight from OSCE. And there's a whole process by which they do desktop monitoring of the documents and curriculum that families are using, as well as on-site monitoring where they actually ask to see artifacts of what the learning is like, where the learning takes place, et cetera. I think the other thing is that sometimes homeschoolers, as I understand it in DC, take part in cooperatives. So I'm a family homeschooling 3 of my children. My neighbor a few blocks away homeschools their 3 children, and families a ward away homeschool their children. And we get together to do social activities and field trips and other outings. And that happens in a structured cooperative effort. Giving each parent a break from their job as homeschooler, but giving chance for homeschool families to come together. So I think that is very different in my understanding of it than the virtual schooling options that families may be looking for. It's also different than pods where folks are hiring an instructor. to provide instruction to their students. This is instruction delivered by the family to their students. And that's my understanding of the definition of OSSI homeschooling, that when families register with the process, it is instruction delivered by folks in the home.
Question.
Yeah.
So I have not seen this in DC. I'm not sure of it. And maybe this is what you're referring to as a pod, Jessica, that is explicitly not allowed at OSSI. But I do know people in Virginia who they get together with other families as you described, and then but then they hire people. I know explicitly around some special ed stuff, but where they hire people to do what, you know, different subjects, different particular instruction related to particular sets of disabilities within the group. So are you suggesting that would not be?
I'm saying that's different than homeschooling.
Under DC law?
Under the way OSSI structures homeschooling, yeah.
And so then what would they be? Private school students? What would they be?
I'm not actually clear. I mean, I know, so for instance, this year, we saw lots of different evolutions of families structuring learning in all sorts of ways, including hiring a teacher to run a pod of students who remained enrolled in their DCPS or DC public charter school. So like I hire Ms. Sally to be in charge of this group of 5 children, mine and others, and all those children are enrolled in school, but Ms. Sally directs their day-to-day activities. That's how I understood this year's podding.
Right.
I do think that if you were enrolling your child in sort of a private tutor setup, I don't know what that is classified as OSSI, but I think all of that is interesting, but outside the bounds of what Dr. Reed is getting at, which is that there are a lot of families this year during COVID who turned to homeschooling as an alternative to either enrolling in their school, which was gone virtual, or leaving for private school. They chose homeschooling. So I think that's the goal of this panel. And that's part of the reason I asked that question, like, what are we hoping to learn? It feels like we're hoping to learn who were homeschooling families maybe before this, but who are homeschooling families now who made this choice, who may be choosing to stay in this realm, why, what should we understand about it, and how might it inform anything the board chooses to do around homeschooling standards. Is that accurate, Carlene, or is that, have I editorialized?
No, that's accurate. I'll also raise another kind of like, I guess not really a story, but kind of like another rationale for a parent. Actually, I talked to this grandparent who her daughter, I'm not sure if they took the route, but at one point was considering homeschooling because the daughter wanted to be helpful in assisting her child with virtual learning, but the DCPS schedule did not work for her family. And because I think either she worked in something about the family schedule just did not work with the school schedule. And it was interesting that the school actually said, well, you can do, you know, your own like kind of homeschooling thing and we can provide like materials. So basically they shifted. So it was just an interesting story because sometimes, especially where I live, you know, the narrative is families don't want to help out with education. And in this instance, the family really did. It's just that the virtual option did not work for that family setup. The mom wanted to be really active in it. So she was considering, I could follow up with the grandma, maybe that could be a panelist or even talk about, give their story. But so yeah, I just wanted to kind of raise like, I think essentially between even what you mentioned, Ruth, about virtual schools, there after we come out of the pandemic or as we're emerging out of the pandemic, it's a lifestyle change, and it would not be wise of us to not consider how families might be responding to this lifestyle change in regards to how they're schooling children. It is usually more helpful when people are proactive to provide like certain resources, like I know Mrs. Wade was mentioning, and I know it's on the family, But I'm also thinking about, our equity conversations, because in the 2 examples I've just given you, like these are African-American families who are east of the river, who are electing this for their family's well-being, because they feel like that's a better option than what, they're seeing from virtual. But like even in Miss Wade's case, her and her husband, they're, doing it, but she, elected to get a math tutor to supplement an area, that she feels like she needs extra support in. So it's kind of a homeschooling conversation. It's also kind of an equity conversation, because there are certain families that can easily access homeschooling. There are families who might have an interest in caring for their own children, but because of maybe financial burden, et cetera. But I mean, I'm probably, I don't know, but I feel like it's just worth listening to, gathering families, listening to what their perspectives are, listening to how they access the process through OSSI, and then possibly us exploring, where and what they testified on is in the purview of the board, or maybe it's not as big of a trend as we're thinking, but my gut says homeschooling and then permanent virtual schooling is another topic are going to be things that we're going to see emerge.
Yeah, I like this idea a lot. And one thing that occurs to me is that it feels like we are aiming for panelists who are families who have chosen this. And we're specifically, it feels like trying to get at families who have unique stories about why they did this. So like Ms. Wade's story about the pandemic, focusing on families east of the river, who I agree with you, I think are not the prototypical expectation of what a person on the street thinks of as that's a typical homeschool family. So I wonder how we best find the folks to be on these panels. It feels like asking Ms. Wade who else she might know from the homeschooling community since she embarked on this year might be one good start. Reaching out to the families you've mentioned, Carlene, to see if folks are interested. I'm happy to look up the names of the 2 homeschool cooperatives I know are located in Ward 6 that pull families from both Ward 7 and 8 as well, and see if we can't add them to our potential outreach list. How else, any other thoughts on how we might find families? What do you think about the idea of having someone from OSSI come speak about it? Is that appropriate for this panel, do you think, Carlene, or should we keep it to families and their stories?
Like our invited guests to kind of match what our topic of the day is. I mean, this is probably something for how we organize our meetings later down the line that I think we're going to talk about. But I think it's something cool about if the public knows that a certain topic, of course, people can testify on anything, but they know like a certain topic is coming up on the board in regards to, a panel or something, that, the invited guests kind of match what the topic is. So yeah, someone from OSSI. I'm not sure who else would be appropriate to invite.
Are you thinking that we would have both members of the public testify on, meaning like we'd have a panel and then we would also let folks know, since this is the topic of the panel, we invite any interested members of the public to come and also offer public comment on the topic?
Could you repeat that? I'm sorry, I was looking at John Paul's question in the chat.
Yeah, that's okay. So we're talking about inviting panelists, and it feels like someone from OSSI would be a panelist. We'll talk about who else should be a panelist, and then also letting the public know that any member of the public with an interest in the topic should come during the public comment period. Great. Yeah. For the families you mentioned, are we thinking about them as panelists, or are you thinking about them as members of the public?
That's a good question. I was initially thinking them as members of the public, but I know we have actually done panels of parents or community members before. So, I mean, it might be worth asking multiple rounds of some folks, or if people know, if the public knows that the panel is going to be OSSI and a few members of the homeschooling community, then maybe the public testimony might just kind of happen to reflect that as well. Mm-hmm. Because it just might be, yeah, I wonder just like rounds of questions. But then I'm also wondering just what that experience would be for parents to have OSSI there.
Right.
And then they, are talking about the process.
Right. No, I can see that. Ruth, did you have another question?
I'm sorry, you were saying that was a plus or a minus, Carlene? I missed that.
It could possibly be a minus, but it also depends on and that could be me. But it also depends, I guess, who we ask. But I know, like, I wouldn't want a parent to give really, something that they're having issue with, and instead of the response, being it's, more of a defense of what the parent mentioned. Or I don't know, maybe indictments. That could be me thinking the worst.
Yeah.
They'd be on a panel, so you'd be asking them questions. I mean, they wouldn't, in theory, be commenting on the other people. I don't have a dog in this game. It doesn't matter, but it strikes me that they could maybe answer questions. I don't know.
I mean, one thing I wonder about is, I think it would be good to hear from Aussie. I know there are a few folks who have been writing about the increase in families choosing homeschooling during the pandemic. There are a couple of articles that I shared, so it might be interesting to see if anyone is researching this, or any journalists who've written about it would be interested in being a panelist to talk about the trend, and then to hear from families who are participants in homeschooling, or maybe someone who runs one of these co-ops, to talk about how the co-op membership changed from pre-pandemic to during pandemic. Because this is in July, I think we still have a little time to think about this. Like, it would be good for us to start looking at who the panelists would be and communicating about this over email. But I think we've got a couple of ideas sorted out. What's on your mind, Carlene?
I'm actually thinking that maybe the panel would make more sense, because at least the topic can at least get covered, and we can take or leave whatever comes of it, and possibly public comment can just match, or we can include other people and just say, like, hey, just FYI, I know you're accessing this, there's opportunity for you to testify at our next State Board of Education meeting. But at least kind of checks the box of our work plan of, we address the topic, we got a temperature check of possibly what's happening. The standards I know are on our list of things, just as we've looked at it as a board recency.
I like that idea. Alistair, what are you thinking? I see a
I have no poker face. I'm thinking of all the different reasons why people choose homeschooling, right? And what's most relevant for us, and how we can serve those families, right? And what the right, if it's leaving for reasons that is our goal to bring them back in to the system, or to support them with additional resources while they're homeschooling, right? I do think that those are two separate paths that would take us down, right? And thinking about some of the parents who have come to testify to us in the past, like Laura, it's going to be a very different reason for why she decided to have her 3 kids in homeschool, or to homeschool her 3 kids, than then reasons of I think the school not being safe, or right, I think I'm not sure if we've mapped out all of those reasons yet, and I don't know if Aussie collects that data actually of why certain parents decide to go down this path. But I'm curious, just so I can better wrap my head around too, how to think about this, Carlene, how you're thinking about the outcome. Is it, and am I missing any options, right? Is it ways that we can then bring them back into the system so that they stop homeschooling? Is that one of the goals, or is it serving the homeschool students better? Yeah. Okay.
It's us being, in our, I guess, regulations, or I'm not sure if it's regulation, not to give some insight into like what the homeschooling standards are. I guess it's the qualitative researcher in me, where I don't like coming to the table with sorted notions about why people are taking certain options. It's the goal to invite as many people as possible so that those themes emerge. So I just want to give our homeschooling community an opportunity to do that. Understand that some individuals have taken this as an option and are going to keep it regardless if it was a pandemic or not. or that this pandemic has exposed families to an option that they may like. They might decide they want to go back. They might decide that, you know, they actually like homeschooling and they need more resources, or that the current process may or may not, you know, support them in, you know, what their goal is for their family. So I would like to hear from basically families or members of the homeschooling community, even maybe teachers or people who provide supplemental opportunities. That could also be something, because I know a lot of our families who seek that option look for recreational opportunities with other organizations to support learning. So my goal is to get as many people to talk about it so that we can know. Or
But in a way, then we're somewhat reason agnostic then, right? If our focus is about supporting them, right? So we could even just a suggestion here. So we could have them fill out information about why over email or through a survey, so that the discussion itself can focus in on what support you need, right? If
the answer could be like they feel well supported in DC, the system of homeschooling. So that could be something totally too. But I mean, are you saying like this group might need guidance on what to...
I'm noticing that I was getting stuck in the, wow, there's so many different reasons why parents may choose this. And if we go down this, you called it, Jessica, last time, the qualitative snowball method. If we go down that method, you know, I think we're stuck in certain social circles, right? And won't actually be able to get out of them, right? If, Laura's reasons for choosing homeschool may not actually bring us to the families who, for religious reasons, choose to right. So I think there's sort of the, how do we actually reach everyone in this space who has decided to go down, I think would be really difficult, right? So I think framing it as something that's not comprehensive is actually really important. Yeah.
Okay, so you're saying like don't just target families?
Well, yeah, but just I think in my mind, it's such a diverse group that it would be hard to capture the full picture of, right.
So like I think that's why, like, you know, we try on our end to invite as many people as possible to either testify verbally or submit written testimony, so that we can possibly, you know, are there any common themes, even if we get a small group, like even if in July we get 10 individuals, are there any commonalities? Do we need to do more follow-up on something? Are there any themes emergent, or is the group so diverse that we don't see any themes emerge? But I think it's worth a temperature check.
Yeah, agreed.
Let me think about this. I think, and just to throw this out and see if it works. So one, I want to put on the table that I don't think we should have a goal of getting people to come back to the public school system as part of the panel. I think that we should expect that families have made a choice for a reason, and that we invite them to share that with us as part of whether they're public testimony or panelists, but that we want to give a platform for folks who have chosen this route to talk to us and to either tell us what they think is working in the supports that exist within OSSE's parameters, or what they would recommend changing in order to provide them with either an easier path to this or more supports for their experience as homeschoolers. I think the second thing is it would be interesting to start coming up with some like archetypes we might mod on the panel. So we're noting that we'd like someone from OSSE so that we understand what are the requirements, what is the regulatory expectations, how does a family find OSSE? Does OSSE ever go out and find families? You know, any of the kinds of things that OSSE would tell us about homeschooling. It feels like we want to have at least one family that is comfortable speaking as a panelist. If Ms. Wade would be willing, I think she would be excellent at it. One, she's testified publicly before. She's a known parent activist, and I think would be really important voice to hear from, since she's already talked with us about it once. So I think having at least one family, maybe two on the panel, if we can find another who'd be willing to serve. And then I think a third archetype we might want is someone, to your point, Carlene, who provides either these supplemental services to homeschoolers or someone who runs one of these cooperatives who helps sort of organize homeschool families to come together. And those might be panel participants. And then we would put out the sort of broad all call to one of the topics for July's meeting is a panel on homeschooling featuring the following folks. We invite any member of the public with a story to tell or questions to ask or information to provide to us about homeschooling to sign up for public comment. Does that feel like an okay way to frame it?
I like it.
Okay. John Paul offered that maybe Aussie could come to the working session prior to this meeting. So maybe that's something we can take back to leadership and see if that works, because that might help address the concern or question of it feeling awkward to have people doing the homeschooling on the same panel with the regulator. Yep, Ruth?
Yeah, that all sounds good. The one thing I would say is I think it's appropriate and fine to say that the purpose of the panel is not to convince people otherwise or compare it to the public schools, but for sure people will have those questions. So I just want to say I would certainly be interested, and I'm sure many other people will be, just in a nice way, what they're getting from there that the public schools don't provide.
Oh, I totally agree. I think, you know, I would expect that we would ask families why they made the choice. I think what I would want to agree to is that we're not going to take an anti-homeschooling stance after we invite people to join us to tell their stories. That would feel rude. So Carlene, it feels like we've got some framing on this. It feels like we need to think about starting to find these folks and thinking about the timeline for inviting them. Maybe gathering possible panelists can be something we can help with. Let us know what would be most helpful.
Yeah, I think I definitely want to take on the challenge of finding as many families who can talk, who can give this
Awesome.
possible. It will be helpful if folks can maybe like get the cooperative folks.
I'll take that on.
Okay. Yeah, but I'll take on the challenge of like trying to get some more families, possible like supplemental providers, that kind of thing, and then maybe circle back in a week or two to see like, did I get anyone? Who do we have?
Sounds great. And Carlene, if it's okay, to the folks I know who run these cooperatives, I'll just introduce them to you. So I'll let you be the coordinator, but I know I have their names in my email somewhere, so I'll find them and intro them.
Sure.
He's gonna go feed you.
Oh, the pets of SBOE again.
Hopefully my husband's gonna feed her, so maybe she'll be quiet.
Okay, anything else that we can do to be helpful on this, Carlene? Awesome. Thank you so much for talking to Zachary and getting this on the calendar and spearheading this. I think it's going to be an interesting discussion.
Yes, thanks for the reminder.
All right, with that, I'm going to turn it over to Alistair to talk with us about literacy. And while you're doing that, Alistair, I'm going to put the link in the chat that Caitlin sent us a while ago.
Just beat you to it.
Oh, you beat me to it. Amazing.
And I'm going to actually add some text to the to our agenda, if I may, at the bottom, because I think part of the next step is actually figuring out who we send this survey to. So we sent the survey to DCPS and Aussie. I also had, just because I was talking with them already, Reading Partners looked it over as well and gave us their feedback in addition to your feedback. So that should all be incorporated in the survey. And at the bottom of the agenda now, I've put a list of organizations that I think we ought to reach out to. And I think my question is actually to Darren, Caitlin, and John Paul, which is, may we get your help actually to, from this list, send out from your account the survey. amazing. So I put some contact information from folks I've already given a warning to of that this is coming out. And I think my ask to the rest of the committee is, would you look at this and add any names of groups that I've missed, or groups that you're like, actually, they don't do literacy. What are you talking about? Take them off. And at the very bottom, I also added, John Paul, I think you would know best, talking with the community schools representatives and kind of the coordinators there, right, of who are the other nonprofits that they partner with already. If someone from the staff could also email Ellen, she's the head of the Youth and Family Services at the DC Public Library, who else the public library partners with that does literacy work, I think would also be helpful to kind of fill out our list.
No problem. One quick question. So I'm looking on the meeting notes where the agenda is, and I'm not seeing the list.
Very, very bottom.
I agree with him. It's not there.
Really?
No, I can see it there.
At the
But I only see one person in this document right now. So maybe it's Alistair and I are the only people in the document.
You think we're in the wrong document?
I'm just gonna copy the document back in the chat. It was I'm using the link that Jessica sent at the very beginning.
So let's see. I still only see
Got it.
one.
Okay.
Okay, now.
Oh, now I
Pictures.
see. Yeah, yeah. Okay. It's not on the Survey Monkey link.
Oh, no, sorry.
No, on the agenda.
So,
I have a question.
hey, Ruth.
So can I ask a question? It's about the list. So these are all nonprofits, presumably. And what about, I mean, insofar as we're trying to show what's available, do we want to show it all? Groups like, I'm thinking especially about Linda Mood Bell, but I'm sure there's some others that they're not nonprofits, but they are providers of specific programs.
That's interesting. Yeah.
I mean, is that something like, I don't know, does anybody provide that, make scholarships or tuition available for it? I don't know how to fit it in, but I feel like they're a really useful player in the landscape.
I feel I think, I'm not thinking about the corporate structure so much as whether or not they partner with our schools and how they're thinking. For me, it's mostly actually about not just thinking about literacy between the hours of 9 and 3 provided by formal educators, right? But also, what is the role of the non-formal and informal learning sectors in supporting literacy outcomes for DC students? And I don't think that it has to be nonprofits. I think my networks are mostly the literacy nonprofits. So Ruth, if you have suggestions for other groups that are, supporting students and their families, right? Like I added the Washington Literacy Center, which is working mostly with adults, but I think that that's actually super relevant because we know that there's a causal link between a parent learning how to read and the results of their child learning how to read as well, right? So for me, there's I think there's a line to be drawn in terms of are they funders or are they providing direct services, right? Because I think if we go into the funding list, it gets a lot wider than this, but if they're service providers, I don't personally think it makes a big difference in how we map this, whether they're for-profit or nonprofit.
And what about, I'm just complicating it yet further, what about groups that are partners with DCPS but not direct service providers? That's not what
you think. Yeah, who are you thinking?
What I was thinking of was Writing Revolution.
So, I mean, I think that's actually relevant, right? Because I'm thinking of programming now in the sort of nonprofit way, right? Where the program is also curriculum development is a program for me, right? To me, that's a direct service, actually. But I know that there's lines there that are not super clear. But for me, as this first time around going at this, right? I don't think we should attempt to even feign to be comprehensive, right?
Okay.
So it's to me, this is sort of a first mapping and that we can add to over time and update over time.
So Alistair, I added 2 groups to the list that I didn't see there, and I put them in as suggestions, so you can tell me if they fit or not. Little Lights and For Love of Children.
Yep, spoke with For Love of Children earlier today, actually. So I'm
great.
sorry.
Did I miss them on the list? No, so I dropped them in there with their links. Little Lights is a center in Potomac Gardens housing project in Ward 6, and they have a program called Reading Heroes that is specifically a year-long tutoring program focused on literacy intervention.
Okay, great.
And in Writing Revolution, I'll just say they partner with DCPS. They have, I'm not totally sure what the state of it is, but it's to use writing as a way of encouraging reading and back and forth. And again, I just want to say on Linda Mood Bell, people who know me know, they provided services that took our child from, basically 0 reading to almost on grade level in a year after 5 years of not. So I regard them as just like super able, but they're not, and once upon a time they partnered with DCPS. I think it's a great shame that they don't. But they're a for-profit, but maybe part of what we want to do is collect the good nonprofits, the effective ones, and also think about ways of making their services more available. So there it is, it's on the list. And I don't know the other ones, but they probably do actually.
So Ruth, just looking at the questions on Alistair's survey, I think Linda Mood Bell makes sense to include on here because there are questions in the survey that ask about whether the organization receives funding, grants, or contracts. So they could say, no, if that's the case. It talks about where they provide the services, and it gives an option of locations owned by your organization or leased, which is true for Linda Mood Bell as best I know. So I think they belong on this list.
Good.
And they certainly have moved we know from your experiences, moved the needle for at least your family, right? So
and I think broadly they're regarded that way, and
right.
I don't know what happened with DCPS, but yeah.
And that's the piece of this, right? I think that is that would be interesting to layer on top of the current literacy strategy that we're building. Great. Okay. So John Paul, I saw your notes. I will go through again and add my contacts, some information there for folks, and appreciate your team's support to reach out to others. Yeah.
So then the only other question that I have would be, when do you want us to send it?
If everyone's okay, I originally was going to just wait for Ashley from Elsie to get back. She's the one who's writing the literacy plan, and she gave her feedback, and we've incorporated it already. So I think if you are all okay with us starting to do the outreach, that would be great. And I don't know how quickly or how who will respond, right? If we get 3 responses in 2 weeks before our next meeting, I think we regroup and come up with another strategy. But if we get quick responses, I think that would I think let's see how many people actually get back to us. But my recommendation would be in this first round we set the deadline for our next working session, so we have something to work from. But well, I guess that would be a month from now, right?
Yeah, one thing I wonder about is, could we say, yeah, could we, if we were to send this out, well, next week's a short week. So John Paul, I wonder, would it make sense to wait until next week to send this, since this is going to hit people's holiday mail weekends, or is it better to send it first?
I mean, I think we might, if it's ready, we might as well send it.
Okay.
And then come Tuesday, we'll say, hey, we sent this at the end of last week. We know it was a holiday. Like, doing an extra reminder isn't a problem. So I guess the question is like, as soon as I get the list of emails and contacts, or If you can also note ones that you don't have a contact on, so I know that those are the ones that I have to identify, we can send it out as, you know.
Great. So what if we were to do that and set like a 2-week response window, Alistair, so that we would have the data in-house in advance of our next meeting as a committee?
Great. I think that works.
So if we have contact information here, we should provide it. John Paul will work to get whatever else we might not have and then send it out. And then we'll aim to have it back. What does that put it at, like June 10th or 11th?
Great. Thank you all. I'm really excited to see where this leads us.
Me too.
Thank you. Yep.
Sorry, I'm totally distracted by the like very loud rainstorm happening outside right now. It is brilliantly sunny and it's pouring.
Oh, we don't have it yet.
And it just left me it must have moved over to you. So that happened to me, 5 minutes ago.
Yeah. It's very distressing. Okay, anything else from us here, Alistair?
No, I think this is great. And once we get the feedback, I think we'll have a better sense of how to actually map this out.
Cool. All right, I love it. With that, Alistair, I'm going to have you put on your other hat and talk to us about the Student Advisory Committee and how it went talking with them about this question around their experience of learning ethnic studies or social studies in their careers.
Yeah, really interesting. And I think, I want to be thoughtful about sort of a point that Carlene raised, which is, how do we actually, who wants to study this? How do the students actually want this? And where does it fit? And what is the actual impact, right, of this? And I think I've been thinking that through. I don't know if I'm paraphrasing what we spoke about, right, Carlene, but it's one of those things where I think it's also hard for me to unpack, if they're a student who's opted in to actually participate in this committee, whose perspective are we missing, right? Because it was overwhelming interest and everyone gave really interesting feedback of sort of, the one that stuck out to me most was, in this definition of ethnic studies as the study of difference, right? The interdisciplinary study of difference, the lack of sort of having every story map back to the norm of whiteness, right, came up multiple times. And it was, I've never heard of, in our curriculum, I never studied the relationships actually between, Asian American and African American activists and their roles together. It was always, here's how the Asian American community related to the white American community, and here's how the Black American community are related to the white community. And it was always kind of done in relation to, right? And that, as also kind of reinforcing a norm, really stood out to me as something that a lot of the students were actually raising that I hadn't necessarily been thinking about. And so those pieces I found really interesting. The way that I had structured this document, and let me see, Jessica, if I can just pull it up, and I'll share the link in the chat.
Okay, I put in the chat the 2 links that you shared with us on Tuesday.
Great, thanks. So one is, as I've been thinking about what our objectives for a panel would be, right? I think it's somewhat, in my mind, similar to how we were thinking about the literacy panel, which is, we're not the only ones thinking about this. And I think that there's been a lot of other interventions already done in this space, right? So but then also various levels of audiences, right? So broadly, I think I would like to know what the methods are that we have to equip DC students with knowledge about difference, right? Rather than framing it as ethnic studies, adding a class, or adding an option is the answer. Rather, kind of thinking, what are the options? If we want to make sure that our students are equipped with this, how do we do it, right? And so I think at there's the macro level, right, which is thinking about the layer of there's ethnic studies as an option or as a mandatory course, right? Like in LA, there's weaving it through social studies. There's right, and what are other states doing in thinking that those options through? And then there's the level of the actual curriculum itself, right? And I think that that's where if I think about sort of the supply chain of this stuff, right, it moves from the standard setting committee down to the LEA. What are the options that each LEA has, right, to decide how they weave this in? And then you move down to the actual educator level, right? What are the options that educators have to weave this in? To me, that made the most sense in sort of how we distinguish, because I think I was getting stuck thinking about how all of these questions weave together, right? And I don't think we need 3 separate panels. Part of what I'm curious about is if there's one of these layers that's most interesting or timely to emphasize, or if we do a kind of more lightning round of information gathering where we try to hit all 3, right? But just just to learn what else is happening, right? Or if we dive deeper into each of them for a longer session. My part of that, and just to kind of finish thinking out loud here with you all, the part of why I think having all 3 together in one panel would actually be quite interesting is that they could also then have some kind of reaction to one another in the chat, right? Of sort of, here's how what you're saying relates to me then as an educator who's done this, and vice versa.
Ruth, Carlene, what are your reactions, thoughts, questions for Alistair? He and I have talked about this a few times, so I'll defer.
Carlene, you want to go first? So I have two reactions. One is, and I don't have a firm view on this or an answer to it. Once we leave standards and we get into the curriculum and we get into that aspect of it, the question is, what are we doing, right? And I have in the past sort of been very interested in that. And I'm trying to think if we've actually done stuff like that I can't remember, but it's insofar as we're providing, here's some great ideas, go do them in your classroom. Here's some ideas, go do them in your school. It can't hurt, right? It's interesting. I'm not sure beyond that what it is, and is that enough, and is that what we're trying to do? And maybe it is. So I guess it's really a question. It's not a pro or a con. It's a reality, and is that where we want to intersect with this? The second thing that I want to just sort of say, kind of react to is, and I've raised this a lot in the social studies standards as well, but I think it's relevant here, which is, you have defined it per the person who was at the student advisory committee as difference, which is a really interesting way to think about it. It's not the only way to think about it. And likely in a class, if you actually had a class, you would talk about different aspects of it.
Yep.
And the one that fascinates me and I think is super important right now is this thread of building democracy, and how do you create a multiracial, multi-ethnic, successful democratic society. I mean, in theory, that is what you know, depending on what side of the ideological fence you're on, right? That is in theory part of what America has been trying to build for a long time.
And
as
the original purpose of our public education system.
Exactly,
right?
exactly. And as unsuccessful as it is in so many ways, it also has accomplished things that others haven't, or accomplished them first, right? And almost always,
Mhm.
historically, it was because groups who weren't white or who weren't considered white at the time, like the Irish, you know, but it was people who weren't considered white who pushed the envelope and pushed suffrage and pushed human rights and pushed new definitions of democracy. And nobody in the country would be experiencing democracy the way we do had it not been for that history. So I just find that a way of sort of talking about the country, but also talking about these really, you know, contributions made by different groups in the society, without which we wouldn't be what we are, you know?
Mhm.
And it's a second thread, I would guess, to difference. They're not the only two, but so that's my other thought.
Going to your first point, are you saying that is it the observation that you're paraphrasing here, interested in topics 2 and 3 that I've laid out here, and that it's may or may not be actually relevant at the board level? Or did I get
Yes.
that right? Yeah,
Yes,
okay.
I think that's right.
That makes sense.
I think
Okay.
that's right.
Mhm.
And I mean, it's sort of what is our purpose here? If it's to interest LEAs in doing something.
I have a very emotional personal purpose, right? And this is why I'm keep kind of trying to find the right way to frame this, which is the Asian students who reached out to me after the attack in Atlanta and said that they had in their entire career not studied anything about their history. That is very upsetting to me, and I find it super problematic. And I don't think it's just the Asian community here that has not seen themselves reflected in our curriculum, or you know, denying everyone else the opportunity to actually learn about how different our experience in history has been. And so to me, that is what's driving me to try to find and piece together the right way to have this conversation at the board level. And I think, you know, I understand the procedural question that's been raised around, you know, calling it ethnic studies or naming African-American history rather than going through the social studies process, right? I get that. And at the same time, I do think that there are conversations that we can have with other experts in this space, locally and nationally, right? That can help inform this very unique opportunity we have right now around rewriting our social studies standards. And I guess that's what it is for me, right? And I don't think I have the answer. I think you know, this piece took me some time to try to just think about how we even frame it, right? So that it is useful. And I think that's the challenge, actually, right? At the level that we're working at, I know what the problem is. And I think I'm trying to get everyone's help to think about how we actually address it. Yeah.
I want to interject for a second, because as I look at the way you talk about sort of the specific objectives for the pieces of this panel on studying differences, two things occur to me. One, the point that Ruth is making around the board's purview being around standards and not around curriculum. And the second piece is around the upcoming SISAC meeting. And I offer that up for one very particular reason, which is one thing we talked about with the SISAC, which is mostly, not exclusively, but mostly educators, is bringing in outside speakers to provoke sort of thinking and continued discussion as we lead towards revised standards. And your third specific objective sort of provokes this for me, which is we know that even when the standards are revised, and so much better, because obviously they will be, because we will have made them so. I'm a little tongue in cheek, but because we know the revised standards will have improvements that we've pushed very hard to ensure we're in the framing. We also know that curriculum will follow from that, but we know that teachers have a lot of control in their own rooms around how they structure a lesson and bring in perspectives that are missing or choose not to. So I wonder if there's a way to at least have one of these discussions in concert with educators, and to offer up this question of what do they do currently? What do educators who might come speak to them offer about how this happens? And what opportunities might be available as new standards are written to provide educators not just curriculum aligned with new and better standards, but also skills about how they continue to bring in perspectives that are essential for the students before them. So just one thought tossing out there is like, you know, I would be happy to entertain the idea that one of these conversations might take place with our CISAC. You've got a group of folks deeply invested in social studies education. You've got a group of folks who are thinking about the new standards. You've got a group of folks, many of whom are educators, who are going to be put upon to implement new standards with these new directives around making sure that students see their own history as well as are exposed to history that is not their own as part of the new standards and curricula.
And actually that framing, Jessica, is very helpful because it helps to narrow in the audience in a way, even though it keeps it broad, right? Which is the audience is actually the committee, right? Who are writing this, because that is the opportunity we have right now. It is not to, you know, I think there's sort of this, yeah, to me, that's the audience actually, right? That is most relevant and timely. And my question would be, you know, would it be interesting for them to hear from Ravi, for example, right, about his work with kind of broadly around this at the academic level? Would it be interesting to hear how academics are monitoring and evaluating the impact of these programs? Would it be interesting for them to look at how other states are legislating this or not? Would it, and you know, I think kind of going through, because right, each of these bullets is actually a very different perspective in a way, right? Is it interesting to look at how the Asian American Education Project is working with different school systems to integrate AAPI narratives into the curriculum? That's way more specific as a case study, right? But is that actually helpful for the committee? Is it helpful to talk to teachers who have been weaving this in ways that are kind of getting press, right? To hear how they've been doing it, right? I think those things for me would be targeted at the committee as sort of what pieces of this, and if it's a lightning round, right? Could it be such that we build something with them, we get all these people to come do a short 2-3 minute talk, and then the people on the committee can follow up with the folks that they find that they would like to learn more about and learn from, right? As advisors, or to learn more case studies about. Again, just trying to come up with some ideas that could help inform the work that you're already doing. But yeah.
So I'll be honest, I think that the second two objectives are probably most likely to have appeal to folks on the CISAC.
Okay, yeah.
And I say that because I think that's the level at which we have asked folks to think, which is sort of like, what are the guiding principles for the standards? And then what will this look like as folks begin to try to implement it in their own classrooms? And how do we build a, one question we asked the CISAC at our meeting in the spring was essentially like, what does it look like to continue to build the social studies community in DC? And what are the opportunities that exist within a collective social studies community to bring our resources to bear together? Whether it's like, you know, the Middle States Council for the Social Studies had a huge representation from Maryland, and a huge representation from Jersey, and a huge representation from Delaware, and like a handful of folks from DC. And I don't think that that's accidental. And I don't, that's not a knock on us, but I think we have not had a collective cross-sector effort at building a social studies community. I think DCPS has a strong social studies community. And I think there are individuals at charter schools who are connected with those folks, but there isn't sort of a statewide teacher social studies community. So I think we got at that with them, that like there are these opportunities to continue building this infrastructure of a social studies community, but a lot of it hinges on relationships and shared work, not so much like an association or a place to be, but this purpose of work together. I think the first specific audience still to me is intriguing for us as a board, because we don't have sort of power to legislate specific courses. We have worked on grad requirements, but it seems to me those folks would have really interesting insights into like the struggles of navigating whatever your particular legislative infrastructure is to get these things through, whether it's the local school board or the county, the state, et cetera. The other thing that occurs to me here is that there are two committees. There's the writing committee, and then there's the SISAC, the advisory committee. I would be loath to host this for the writing committee at the moment because they are writing. And they're starting their writing and they're also finishing their teaching year. So it would be a lot to host it for them. I think it would be totally appropriate to host it for the SISAC and invite any members of the writing committee who wanted to join it. So that it was left as an option for folks involved in the writing. But I think if we ask them to take on one more thing, it might be the straw that breaks the back.
Yep, I understand. And I guess so if we were to do, number 2 and 3 here with them, where it's right now it's not highlighting any local voices, right? It's more learning about how other people are doing it. And I guess if it's, and weaving in what you were saying about building community, there's plenty of educators here who have been weaving this in their curriculum regardless. I'm raising Kat here because she also, she built hers with Janelle Monáe and it's, got millions of views, right? So it's more of a sort of, these are the ones that have gotten the most press, right, nationally. But if we could find, if there are local educators that they could hear from, right, where they could say, okay, this is how what we build is directly being interpreted by our teachers, right? I think that could actually be interesting, right, and helpful. If I assume that's already been done though, right?
Meaning like speaking with local educators about what they're doing?
Yeah.
There's been some of that for sure, especially because some of those local educators are the ones who are part of the
Fighting it is, right.
We've had folks speak, like we had a panel at the National Council for the Social Studies. Actually, I had 2 panels at the National Council for the Social Studies. One of our members of the SISAC spoke to the U.S. Chamber of Commerce about their civics effort on his work at Statesman Prep, and the civics, the various civics lessons that he and his co-teachers have created. That's Mr. Bethia. So we've definitely had an opportunity to showcase folks who are doing this work locally. But I think, again, if you did sort of the 2 options, then you've got essentially 40 minutes of people speaking, which would leave 20 minutes for either like questions or other sharing, or you could extend it to a 90-minute session and have much more sort of interplay, including like a small group thing. So, I mean, I think there's still development to figure out like what the exact agenda time would be. But to me, that's one way to put it. Carlene, you were nodding along, so I want to make sure I turn the tables to you after you swallow your water.
Thank you. I'm starting to get like sneezy, and so I probably need an allergy pill. Hopefully it's just that. Anyway, yeah, Alice, I'm glad you mentioned, I was shaking my head because that was going to be the comment I was going to make about local educators and highlighting that, because I can just imagine our education community saying like, we've done that here. We have some great examples, and want to feel, included to share if they haven't already had opportunity. So that's the only thing I was going to contribute. And you put that in your comments. So.
Jessica, what's our timeline? I think I've got to let this marinate, and I would love your help to kind of let it marinate too. But when is it actually still relevant?
Well, so here's what the timeline for social studies is.
Mhm.
The technical writing committee is bringing its first draft back to the SISAC at the end of July.
Okay.
The SISAC has a meeting coming up on June 8th. I think it's too soon, obviously, to do, like, that would be too fast a turnaround to get on folks' calendars at this point. So the next SISAC meeting, if you bear with me 1 second, this is in our project plan. I just got to scroll there. Our next SISAC meeting after June 8th is September 21st. And the standards will not be final then, but they'll be getting close to there. So I feel like the idea would be, it would be great to do this in July, if it's possible, and to host sort of a special meeting of the SISAC to invite them.
Yep.
And we could invite both them and the writing committee at that point.
Mhm.
But I think July, August at the latest would be the right timing to do this. That said, for it to have any relevance to like revisions of the standards.
Yep.
That
Understood.
said,
Okay.
I think to the earlier part of the conversation, even when the standards are written, there are ongoing discussions to be had about what curriculum lines up with the standards and how that curriculum is reflective or not. How teachers are
Mhm.
making the standards real for themselves in their classrooms with their students and what that looks like. So I think the question here is, are we trying to influence the standards?
Mhm.
Or are we trying to influence the implementation of the standards?
Mm.
Because that gives you a much longer timeline.
And that gets more into sort of practices to share between educators, right? How you interpret the standards, what resources you can turn to.
That's right.
To align to the standards, what flexibility you have within the standards, right? Those questions then come up that could be very interesting, again, to highlight, local and maybe national voices, right?
That's right. That's right. And I mean, I think to Ruth's point earlier, it's the place where we have the least authority and the place where there's the most opportunity for things to be done differently than they have been. And I will totally editorialize for a second. And Ruth's heard me do this before, but DC doesn't have a state curriculum. We don't have a voluntary state curriculum. Each LEA gets to write its own curriculum.
Mhm.
It would be, to me, an incredible shame if we didn't, with these brand new standards written by teachers from LEAs all across the city, if we didn't start to have some co-created curricular units that teachers write and use across LEAs. There would seem to be no reason that couldn't happen or shouldn't happen. We don't have an ability in the law to mandate a common curriculum, but I'll totally name drop some of my rock star favorite social studies teachers. It would be a darn shame if Karen Lee from Thurgood Marshall and Jessica Rucker from DCPS and any number of the wonderful teachers we have Jessica Rucker from E.L. Haynes and any of the number of wonderful history teachers we have in DCPS didn't show up together to co-write some curriculum and then have it used at all their LEAs.
Mm.
I haven't been secretive about that at all. Like, I think that's the way we should go as a state, that we should have this collective work by folks across LEAs writing things together.
And right, there's an interesting role that we could play as conveners of that, or at least the connectors for it.
Yeah,
right?
and Aussie has also sort of nodded along as I've said this, and Thacker Bartlett and I have talked about this, that like these are the kinds of opportunities that exist in this space.
Yep.
That we haven't had the chance to harness before, and we should do now.
Okay, thank you. I found this really helpful, and again, you're watching me struggle as I try to kind of make my way through all the options to see what makes sense. But I think I feel good to move on to the next item, Jessica, and then come back to this.
Great. Okay, so the next item is social studies. So we're already sort of there. Any parting thoughts, Ruth or Carlene, before we go to the social studies update?
No, you can see, I mean, I just put in the question that could straddle any of these three, that sort of broadens it out from difference to a bunch of other things. And, you can't do everything, so it makes sense to focus. I just wanted to throw that out as certainly one that I would focus on in terms of this. That's all.
Yeah, I think having focus is helpful for sure. So on the social studies standards updates, the technical writing committee continues to meet. Unfortunately, they continue to meet on the same evenings we have working sessions and meetings. So I end up getting to be there for half an hour of their meeting and then having to jump to our meetings. They have formed writing groups and are beginning to meet in those groups and start to write. So I look forward to starting to see some more work from them soon and having more things to share on that. But we do have a SISAC meeting coming up on June 8th. And we had talked about a couple of different ideas for this SISAC meeting, and I just wanted to see if you all had any other ideas or suggestions. One thing we had talked about was sort of bringing in a guest speaker to talk with the group about a topic of interest. We also had asked the SISAC in previous meetings to talk with us about how we could create a social studies community as we go forward. And so we've had folks start to fill in for us in a survey, sort of what are the groups they are already part of, things like Teaching for Change, et cetera, that are DC area educators for social justice, other groups they are part of. So we could do sort of an abbreviated version of what we're doing for the literacy plan, Alistair, which is mapping the social studies community in DC, sort of who belongs to what and what are the organizations that form that. So we could spend the meeting focused on that. There are also lots of other things we could focus on. So I'm curious if there are any particular interests you have that you'd love for our SISAC to spend some of their time together on June 8th. They'll be together for only an hour. We made these 4-hour-long quarterly meetings, knowing that they gave us a lot of time last year, and this is sort of their off year, but we want to make sure we're still keeping in touch with all the folks on our committee. No, they have no drafts yet. The draft that they're getting is at the end of July. There are members of the writing committee on the SISAC. There are 5 who cross over. So I'm sure we'll have an update from them. We'll give them time and space to share with us the latest and greatest. But there's no draft that's going to be shared.
It's interesting, Jessica. I think my mind goes to either one level of analysis above or one level below, which would be especially the one level below is so much work and so much time, right? And the one above, it gets quite political, right? And so where they inhabit, it feels almost the most stable right now, actually. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And so it is. I go back to the kind of general frameworks then of would it be helpful to I like what you're recommending in terms of mapping out, building community, right? And or even, looking at a case study and unpacking it together or something like that, right? Where it's learning together, it's getting to know one another, it's mapping out stakeholders and having stronger foundations for future partnerships, right? Because there's no way that you can tackle all of the different topics within that hour in the detail, right? So and it's not the right time to do that. So I like where you're going with it already. Yep.
So Darren and I are meeting tomorrow morning to sketch out an agenda. I will send that agenda to all of you before we send it out to the SISAC, just to give you an idea of where we're going and get any feedback that you may have. But given sort of the discussion we had tonight, it does feel like getting an update from the 5 folks who are on the writing committee about where they are and how that's going, talking about this data from their mapping of the social studies community, and then maybe doing some sort of shared piece of work together, whether it be like pulling out something from that mapping to do a little deep dive activity on might make the most sense. I'd love to, if it's okay, also preview for them that we're talking about coming back to them with an event to talk about this idea of exposing students to difference, and thinking about that in the context of ethnic studies and children having access to windows and mirrors, because I think they may also provide some interesting insights just on the like topic being floated. I'll spare them sort of our current deep thinking on it. No, just because I think we're still processing that. But I'd love, if it's okay with you, just to float that idea that like we'd love to come back to them with an invitation and see what general reactions or questions they have.
And who they might want to hear from, actually, right? I think that would actually be really helpful. Is it from other states? Is it our teachers? Is it our LEA leaders, right? Is it, right? I think that would be, is it content experts actually on certain themes, right? I think that's where my thought process around this gets really stuck and overwhelmed.
Yeah. Okay. I love that idea, Alistair. I will definitely do that. Okay. Anything else on social studies at this point? Great. So with 4 minutes left, I have one request to make, which is in our collective work plan. We have not made too many updates to the individual topics below in a few, since last time we met. So if you would go into that work plan, which is hyperlinked in the agenda, sometime before our next working session, and just add in any of the next steps. So like things that you're doing around recruiting panelists, Carlene, or the fact that homeschool panel is now happening in July. Alistair, if you'd make the updates about the literacy survey when it's going out, when we're getting a due date, that'll just help us all keep track of what's happening when, and make sure there's a common place that the staff and other members of the board can go if they want to see what we're doing when.
Great.
All right, with that, I have nothing else. We ended a little later than I thought, but you still have 3 minutes that you're getting back.
Thanks, everybody, for those 3 minutes.
All right, thanks for really deep discussion tonight. I appreciate it.
Bye, everybody.
Thanks.